And thank you, Georges, for inviting me to this conference. Now, I'm going to talk about basically the silver production in 17th century Spanish America by taking into consideration not only the volumes that were produced and where they were sent as an aggregate, but taking into consideration where they were produced by taking into account the regions where they were produced and where they were sent. So it was. It's basically by observing the way in which the merchant networks functioned at that time. That is, I think, a very important point to take into consideration. So this paper is just a preliminary approach to this whole topic. I intend to do much more research, but I very much welcome any comments you would like to give me to improve this approach. Now, my statistical techniques that I'm using for analyzing the series are based on autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity models. I'm going to come to talk about this at a later stage of my presentation. Yes, and my point of departure was the following: if we see that the works that have been done on precious metals production of silver, in particular in Spanish America, they focus mostly on the volumes that were produced and where they were shipped, right? We have, for instance, the question of about which destiny they had in respect to where they were produced hasn't been studied well enough, I think. Where the provenance question hasn't been looked at deeply enough. And I feel this is very important because I've been studying the development of exchange rates in 17th century Castile, and I believe there is the issue of merchant circuits play a very important role in determining the copper to silver exchange rate. Right? More than the volumes of the whole production of silver in the colonies, it's how much silver flew into Spain through these networks that I think is important, right? And that's why what I'm trying to look into. It's difficult to determine, but I'm going to try to use statistical methods to help clarify where metals went to. So the way I will do it is by comparing volatility patterns in the silver production, right? And these volatility patterns will have to be complemented by more qualitative information that I'm planning to gather. At this stage, I have only covered the statistical aspect of this approach. Now, I'm going to compare the volatility patterns of the production of silver in both Mexico and Peru during the 17th century, which were the two largest centers in silver production during the 17th century. And then I'm going to compare this series to exchange rate series. Of silver to copper, to Vellon, basically, is exchange rate series in 17th century Spain. Now, we see a bit of background information about the literature that most of you know very well already, I suppose. It's Hamilton's series were published in 1934. Next year will be 80 years of the publication of the American treasure and American metals and price revolution in Spain, right? Next year will be 80 years of the publication of that, and that, as you know, had a huge impact yeah, in terms of quantifying the volumes of metals that were produced. It had also an impact and the historians often interpreted those patterns of production in line with a level of economic activities in the colonies, and we come across some problems in that respect. It's only later that we find that through studies such as ones by Brading and Bakewell on mining, yeah, that it couldn't be generalized that there would be a crisis, a situation or a crisis in 17th century Spanish America just because of the fact that those volumes of the production of silver declined during that time, right? But it's Tepasque and Klein and who started to put forward this idea that the fact that mining as a whole was not producing the volumes that it did produce towards the turn of the century, that didn't mean that the whole region was going through a crisis. Yeah, because we have pockets of prosperity in different regions throughout the 17th century too. Now Dennis O'Flynn and Arturo Giraldes also, through their research on the metal transfers from America to the East, yes, sort of strengthened this theory that perhaps the reason why not so many, the volume of precious metals that was reaching Spain was not because there was a crisis of some sort in Spanish America. It was really because those metals were diverting to different routes, right? And the production may have declined, but there were still pockets of prosperity throughout the Spanish America. So now I'm going to, as I said before, the question about the origin of those metals, yeah, and where they were transported to has not been looked into as much as well. Most people focus on the volumes as such, but with less interest in the routes that they followed. And it is difficult to track the exact routes, and that's why I proposed this method, this statistical method, to help clarify what happened with those metals. Now, Richard Gardner published a comparative study of silver production in Peru and Mexico throughout the colonial period, right? He carries out an analysis and works out that there was an upward trend throughout the colonial period in the case of Mexico, right? And he uses ordinary least squares to work out this trend, which was like the pinnacle of sophistication in terms of statistics in the 1990s, when he published his studies. And now we know that we have a non-stationary series, which is what these series are. They are non-stationary. There are other methods that should be employed, but I mean the overall trend, because we have a very large data set. It was okay. His approach. He used moving averages to work out the long run trend of production, and he concluded that in the case of Peru there had been a decline throughout the colonial period, and the Mexican trend was upward throughout the colonial period, right? I'm going to just focus on a section of this data, right? Now, I'm going to focus just on the first half of the 17th century, right? And there the situation is of decline in both series, Mexico's and Peru's. The trend, the overall trend is declining, right? But they have different characteristics in terms of volatility, as I'm going to point out in a moment. Yeah, we know, this is as a background information, that during the 16th and 17th centuries, Peru contributed to a much higher degree than Mexico towards the overall silver production, right? Peru's maxima could reach about 12 million pesos, yeah, 272 maravedis, and the production maxima in the Mexican production would be at around 6 million throughout the 16th and 17th century. It's only after the 18th century that the trend of the Mexican production increased steadily, but during and basically overtook that the Peru in terms of overall production. Now, I believe the total volumes of silver produced then are deceiving, right? In terms, because one should look at silver that was produced in different areas as basically a different type of commodity, because the production costs were different. Yeah. The production techniques were different, the geographical characteristics were different, right? So it has been worked out by the historians who studied the mines that the production costs in Peru were much higher than in Mexico, right? Despite the fact that the overall production was much higher, also production costs were higher. And there was in terms of the governance of the two areas, there was also a discrepancy. Yeah, we know that in Peru the mita was used, and the mita is a tribute system that was inherited from the Incas that forced workers, the Indians who worked in the mines, to work 4 months a year without any pay, just to force with a minimum pay of course, but it was forced labor. They were coerced to work for 4 months a year in the mines, right? The outcome was depopulation on the area. Yeah, and it was. Historians often wonder what were the reasons of that population, and in fact, it was a negative incentive. What was put into practice there, because population migrated away from the mines in order to avoid to be recruited in the mita system. So, it was much more difficult to recruit mine workers in Peru than in Mexico, so due to the fact that in Peru population was lower and more scattered. Population in Mexico was more evenly distributed, especially around those mining areas, mining centers, and basically, in Mexico, very early, the salaried work was introduced, and Bakewell believes that that's one of the main reasons why the mines were more productive. Right, the existence of salaried work made a huge difference. There was also salaried work in Peru, and throughout time, the proportion of salaried workers increased. However, the mita system was retained till well into the 18th century, when it was finally abolished. Yeah, there were other forms of forced, coerced labor also in Mexican mines, but were at a much lower scale, because it was not really necessary to coerce workers to work in Mexican mines in certain areas. Yeah. In the north of Mexico, the situation was a bit different, and the naborías were introduced that were also comparable to a tribute system, but the scale was much smaller than the one in Peru with the meter. Okay. Now we have the labor was a factor of important factor of production when we talk about mining, and another input, very important input was quicksilver or mercury, and that supply of mercury determined also the volumes of production of the mines. Yeah. The mercury in the two regions came from different places. In Mexico, the mercury was supplied from Almedén, which is in Castilla, North Castilla, Ciudad Real, and in Peru, the mercury came from Huancavelica, which is in the same country, but still it had to be transported by ship. Had to be shipped to Potosí, which is where the most productive mine was in Peru was. So it's the production, the volatility in the production of silver was linked to the nature of mining as such on one hand, and also on the nature of the quicksilver production, which was quite volatile too. Yeah, and if we compare volatilities in the quicksilver production, we see that the quicksilver that was produced in Peru, that production was much more volatile than the one produced in Almedén. So we have this situation here. We know that the Fugas were granted the right to mine mercury in Peru, right? And that privilege was expired towards 1600, and it's then when the production of silver, the overall silver production in Peru started declining. We know that Potosí still remained as a very productive mine throughout the colonial period, but it was just that superstar mine that produced a very, very high proportion of the overall silver production in Peru. Yeah. So this volatility in the quicksilver production was spilled over to the silver production. So we can talk about volatility spillovers. And this volatility spillover can be observed both in the Mexican and Peruvian case, although it at a lesser degree in the Mexican case. Yeah. So volatility, it has been acknowledged to be an important factor determining the later development of mining in Latin America. However, a closer analysis of such volatility has not yet been carried out, and that's what I'm attempting to do at the moment. Yeah, I started off with a histogram. Yeah, this is comparing the volatility with just the frequency distribution of silver production in 17th century New Spain and Peru respectively. As we can see, the data in the case of Peru were more spread out. Yeah, this distribution is more platykurtic, and the Mexican distribution is more leptokurtic. We know from financial economics that investors prefer leptokurtic distributions to platykurtic distributions because they denote a lower variance, right, and more reliability when it comes to returns. Yeah, this is the first depicted Also, the Peruvian distribution shows like two peaks, which is almost bimodal, yeah, and that is not very well. It's less reliable, basically. The variance is larger, and also the type of distribution is less reliable in terms of returns than the one in Mexico. We have, then what I did was I took a Lagrange multiplier test and tested whether that volatility was determined just by the individual observations or if there was a link between the volatility observed in a previous period and a later period. Because sometimes volatility is contagious, to say so, that when we have an observation, a period of high volatility, it's not due to the observation as such. It's also, that volatility can also be attributed to the fact that in the previous periods, volatility has been high. Yeah. So I controlled for that, yes, and I took that into consideration, and I produced this series that were basically based on the data passed by Tepasque. Yeah, that was the latest ones that were published in 2011 posthumously. I demeaned the series. I took away the mean. I took away this effect of volatility. Yeah, of volatility that may have been caused by the previous observation. Yeah, and I obtained this. This is basically the variance, which is the square root. The variance is the square of the standard deviation. Yeah, it's a measure of volatility used in financial economics. The blue line is the conditional variance of the Mexican silver production. Yeah, and the red line is the one for Peru. It is we can see that the variance. Yeah, of Peru is much higher than in the case of Mexico, right? And it basically that it changes. It is not only higher. Of course, the production was higher, so one may expect that the variance will also be higher. But it's not only that. The production, the maxima in Mexico were half of those maxima in Peru, but still, as you see, the variance is much higher, yeah, in relative terms. And how did may people have reacted to this variance? Yeah, that's something I still have to research, because I would like to complement this analysis with qualitative sources. Yes, because this alone doesn't tell anything to anyone, that's clear, but I will use it as a tool to help understand what happened with the reasons why the two regions developed differently. Now, this higher volatility in Peru may have physical explanations, the way that mining was carried out. Yeah, we know that Potosi was basically a peak, right? And it was dug into like a Swiss cheese, basically. They dug holes into it, and when the ores were exhausted, they would dig another tunnel, to look for another ore. Mexican mines were more subterraneous, and that this has determines the volatility for sure. I will have to look a bit closer into these physical aspects that determine volatility. Now we have other factors that may explain this difference in volatility. The fact that mining camps in Mexico were more spread out, right? So there's Peruvian production relied mostly on one particular mine, whereas production in Mexico was more widespread. Yes. So if some ores were exhausted, other ores were still being exploited. So it's that would have diminished the volatility. Yeah. Then we have in Mexico there were better established commercial links in Mexico. We have the Consulado de Mercaderes, yes, and this better established commercial links may have been a result also of this less volatile production in silver, yeah, because these merchants invested in the silver industry at that time, and of course, if investors are looking for a safer returns, so that this might have contributed to the development of a better knitted network in Mexico than in Peru too. Now we have then the aspect of trade, right? That we have this merchant networks linked Spanish America with Asia, yeah, through Mexico. We still have the fairs of Veracruz and the fairs of Acapulco that were taking place throughout the 17th century, right? And this merchant activity may have also contributed to a more stable environment in the mining industry in Mexico, as compared to Peru. Now, the downward trend in silver production that is, I mean, as far as we know, happened. However, there were pockets, as I mentioned, of prosperity in certain areas, such as Zacatecas. The golden age of Zacatecas was during the 17th century. There was also spillover effects. The prosperity in certain mines spilled over to other industries that provided complementary services to the mining sector. Yeah, and those basically. That also triggered trade, because there was still a demand for Spanish goods, yeah, throughout that time. So the silver that might have been produced in Mexico might have been flown to Spain, basically, and that may have affected. I mean, I'm talking tentatively at the moment. I cannot prove anything at the moment, but I'm just talking tentatively to explore these routes. Now, this silver that was produced in Mexico and moved into Spain through these merchant networks may have affected this exchange rate of silver in respect to the yuan in Castile. Okay. Now, as I said, this is work in progress. I will have to do a huge amount of research to have any conclusive results. So far, what I have done is I have taken the logarithms of the silver production in both areas, Peru and Mexico, and the logarithms of the silver to copper exchange rate in Castile. Yes, the logarithms reflects a growth rate, right? So we see that the tendency of the growth rate resembles. I mean, this is the Peruvian one. Yes, the growth rate, and this section grows, right? And then it grows up to this point and then declines. The Mexican growth rate grows rapidly up to this point, and then the overall tendency is to drop down, more similar to the one followed by the exchange rate example here. So, so far this is how far I have come in this in this aspect of my research. It is I have carried out a co-integration test, yes, and it worked out positively in terms of the Mexican and Mexican silver production and the exchange rate. I mean, this is visible from this diagram. They sort of follow a similar trend, deterministic trend. Yeah? That, I mean, so far, as I said before, I need much more information to have any conclusive results. Yeah, but this is what I'm doing at the moment. I intend to carry out to keep following this, and also complementing it with more qualitative sources. Now, these are my two conclusions so far. They're just preliminary. I have first of all that there had been this hypothesis that had already been there, that the relative stability of the Mexican series were in line with the later development of the, that created the base for the later development that Mexican mining experienced in the 18th century. I mean, that had been suggested already, so I'm just confirming this theory. And the second part is that basically the trajectory, there is a certain resemblance in the trajectory of this growth of rate between the Mexican silver production and the exchange rate of silver-copper exchange rate throughout the 17th century, which might point towards a relationship with this between those two variables, right? I mean, this is the first step, and I hope to be able to have more conclusive results in the future. Okay, thanks very much.